Picture this. You're standing in the dust-choked streets of Karakoram in 1253, watching a line of ragged Buddhist monks and weary silk merchants file past the imperial guards. To the world, this is the invincible heart of an empire, yet a terrifying secret lies hidden beneath those coarse robes. Mongol counterintelligence officers have just intercepted a whisper that should have been impossible to hear. 400 elite fidai, the most feared killers of the Order of Assassins, have successfully vanished into the city's crowds. They aren't here to trade or prey. They carry small, curved blades dipped in a neurotoxin so potent that a mere scratch ensures a screaming death. Their singular objective is to plunge those blades into the throat of the great Khan Monka. This audacious move marks the true beginning of the war between the Mongols and the Order of Assassins. While the Mongol court glittered with stolen gold and silk, these 400 shadows moved closer to the imperial pavilions every hour, threatening to decapitate the world's only superpower. If they struck home, the empire would fracture into 1,000 warring tribes. If they failed, they would ignite a genocidal fire that would hunt their kind to the ends of the earth. Newly uncovered records from the Persian historian Juvayni reveal that the Khan's guards didn't just find assassins. They found a map of a shadow state that believed it could kill its way to global dominance. Can a group of mountain-dwelling mystics actually survive when they force the Mongol war machine to stop conquering nations and start hunting individuals? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this, and please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Minka Khan did not react with a public display of rage. He sat in his heavy timber throne and watched as his guards dragged the captured infiltrators across the stone floor. One by one, the poisoned daggers were tossed into a heap at his feet. The metal clattered, a sharp sound that signalled the end of a century-old status quo. For 160 years, the Nizari Ismaili state, the Assassins, had used this exact brand of terror to paralyze every sultan and crusader king in the Middle East. They operated from the Eagle's Nest of Alamut, a fortress perched so high in the Elburz Mountains that the clouds often obscured its gates. They believed the mountains made them gods. They believed the Mongols were just another group of nomadic horsemen who would eventually tire of the steep climbs and go home. They miscalculated the Mongol memory. Munka turned to his brother, Hulagu, and handed him a mandate that bypassed all traditional diplomacy. He ordered Hulagu to march west with 1/5 of the entire empire's military manpower. This wasn't a mission to expand borders. It was a mission to erase a name from history. Hulagu moved with a terrifying mechanical precision. He didn't just mount his horse and charge, he transformed the landscape. Thousands of Chinese engineers began constructing a road that stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the peaks of Persia. They hammered timber into bridges over raging rivers that had never been crossed by an army. They levelled mountain passes with iron picks and black powder, creating a highway for the heaviest siege equipment the medieval world had ever seen. While the assassins sharpened their knives in their high towers, the Mongols were busy stockpiling grain at intervals of every few miles across thousands of leagues. Hulagu's officials seized every blade of grass and every bushel of wheat along the route, ensuring his 150,000 soldiers would never have to stop to forage. The Mongol war machine was no longer a swarm of horsemen. It had become a slow-grinding hydraulic press. In the mountain fortresses of Kohistan, the first assassin outpost watched the horizon. They expected to see a fast-moving cavalry raid that they could wait out behind their thick stone walls. Instead, they saw a literal forest of wood and iron moving toward them. The Mongols brought massive traction trebuchets, disassembled and carried on the backs of thousands of camels. These machines could hurl boulders weighing hundreds of pounds over distances the assassins' archers couldn't even reach. Hulagu's vanguard didn't stop to negotiate. When they reached the first Nizari stronghold, they simply surrounded the mountain, cut the water lines, and began a systematic bombardment that lasted day and night. The sound of stone shattering against stone echoed through the valleys, a rhythmic drumming that announced the arrival of a new kind of war. The assassins had spent generations perfecting the art of the individual kill, but they now faced an enemy that treated war like a massive engineering project. The psychological shock rippled through the Nizari leadership. Their secret messages, once delivered by shadows in the night, were being intercepted by Mongol patrols. Their governors, who had once held kings in check with a single letter, now watched as their outer defences were pulverised by engineers who didn't even care to look them in the eye. As the dust from the first fallen towers drifted toward the grand fortress of Alamut, the reality of the situation became undeniable. The shadow was no longer the hunter, the shadow was being hunted by the sun. To understand why the assassins felt safe while the world's largest army marched toward them, you have to look at the ground beneath their feet. In the harsh, jagged ridges of the Elburz Mountains in northern Persia, there is a peak called Alamut. In the local dialect, the name means the eagle's nest. It is a massive, natural slab of rock that rises vertically out of the valley, accessible only by a single, narrow, winding path that forces any climber to expose their back to the defenders above. In 1090, a man named Hassan-i-Sabah didn't capture this fortress through a bloody siege. He infiltrated it, converted the garrison to his radical branch of Ismaili Islam, and simply handed the previous owner a draft of 3,000 gold dinars as payment for a castle he had already stolen. From that moment on, Alamut became the brain of a shadow state that would haunt the nightmares of the medieval world for over a century and a half. Hassan-i-Sabah was a master of psychological infrastructure. He knew his small community could never win a pitched battle against the massive Seljuk or Ayyubid empires. Instead, he weaponized the human mind. He transformed the concept of the martyr into a political scalpel. His followers, the Fidai, were trained from youth in the arts of linguistics, disguise, and patience. A Fidai might spend 3 years living as a devout monk in a rival sultan's mosque, gaining the ruler's trust, eating at his table and sleeping at his door. Then, with a single whispered command from Alamut, that monk would draw a blade and end a dynasty in the middle of a crowded Friday prayer. This was the old man of the mountain system. Oh, it was a strategy based on the idea that no king is powerful if he cannot trust his own shadow. Legend often speaks of secret gardens and hashish-induced visions used to brainwash these killers, but the historical reality was far more disciplined. The library at Alamut was one of the greatest centres of learning in the world, filled with texts on astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. The men who lived there weren't drugged fanatics. They were highly educated operatives who believed that their leader was the infallible mouthpiece of God. This absolute devotion created a terrifying tactical advantage. While other armies fought for gold or land, the assassins fought for a seat in a celestial paradise they believed they had already seen. The Order's power grew until they controlled a network of over 50 mountain fortresses, these stretching from the borders of modern-day Afghanistan to the coast of the Mediterranean. They operated like a medieval version of a private intelligence agency. They would sell their services to the highest bidder, then turn around and assassinate the very person who had hired them if it served their long-term survival. One famous story tells of a Seljuk sultan who sent an army to destroy Alamut. He woke up one morning to find a dagger pinned into the ground next to his bed, accompanied by a note that simply said, "What is placed in the hard ground can also be placed in your soft breast." The Sultan immediately ordered his army to retreat. This was the world the assassins inhabited, a world of fragmented kingdoms, shifting loyalties, and rulers who were easily terrified by a blade in the dark. For 166 years, this strategy was flawless. They had survived the Crusades, outlasted the rise and fall of Saladin, and watched as dozens of empires crumbled around them. Their fortresses were engineered with massive cisterns for water and granaries carved directly into the cold mountain stone, capable of holding enough food to withstand a 10-year siege. They viewed the coming Mongol tide through this lens of historical arrogance. They assumed the Mongols would be like the others, superstitious, disorganized, and vulnerable to the fear of the hidden blade. The Mongol arrival changed the rules of the game. When Hulagu's scouts first entered the valleys below Alamut, they didn't see a target that needed to be charmed or intimidated. They saw a problem of physics. The Mongols were a culture that had perfected the art of the total hunt. Every year, they practiced the Nurge, a massive hunting circle that stretched for miles, driving every living creature toward a central killing zone. To the Mongols, the Order of Assassins were just a particularly difficult breed of prey that had run into a high hole. While the assassins waited for the Mongols to send an ambassador they could threaten or a general they could kill, the Mongols simply began stripping the land bare. They methodically cleared the surrounding villages, removing the assassins' local intelligence networks and food supplies. They didn't care about the daggers in the night because their camps were structured with a concentric security system that made infiltration impossible for anyone who didn't look, speak, and smell like a man of the steppes. The psychological weapons that had paralyzed the Islamic world for generations were suddenly useless. You cannot intimidate a machine that only cares about logistics and stone-crushing power. As the Mongols began to assemble their giant Chinese catapults at the base of the cliffs, the leaders inside Alamut realized they weren't facing another king. They were facing the end of their world. Hulagu Khan did not resemble the wild, impulsive conquerors of legend. He approached the annihilation of the assassins with the clinical detachment of a master clockmaker dismantling a faulty mechanism. When he received the mandate from his brother Munka in 1253, he knew he was being handed more than a military campaign. He was being given a project of total erasure. Hulagu spent nearly 3 years in a state of obsessive preparation. He understood that the mountain fortresses of Persia could not be taken by the traditional Mongol method of lightning-fast horse raids. To kill the eagle in its nest, he would have to build a road to the sky. The scale of this mobilization remains one of the most staggering logistical feats of the medieval era. Hulagu commanded that every 10 men across the entire Mongol Empire provide 2 of their number for his expedition. This created a colossal force of over 150,000 seasoned warriors, but the soldiers were only the beginning. He drafted 1,000 households of Chinese engineers, experts who held the secrets of mechanical destruction. These men were the masters of the Huopao, early gunpowder weapons, and the massive, as complex traction trebuchets that could dismantle stone walls with the precision of a surgeon's knife. Instead of charging blindly toward the Elburz Mountains, Hulagu transformed the landscape of Central Asia into a conveyor belt of death. His advance was preceded by a massive engineering corps that acted as the vanguard. They didn't scout for enemies, they scouted for obstacles. They built permanent wooden bridges over the wide, churning rivers of the Oxus and the Jaxartes, capable of supporting the weight of thousands of heavy supply wagons. They carved wide, flat roads through narrow mountain passes that had previously only seen the hooves of nimble goats. This was Mongol siege warfare on a continental scale, a methodical paving of the way for an inevitable hammer blow. As the army moved, it consumed the world around it. Thus, Hulagu's administrators established a sophisticated network of supply depots and grain silos every few miles along the march. Thousands of camels were pressed into service, their backs laden with the disassembled parts of the great siege engines. The Mongols weren't just bringing men, they were bringing a city of iron. Every night, the Mongol camp was laid out in a precise geometric grid, protected by a perimeter of sharpened stakes and constant patrols. The assassins watching from the high ridges found no gaps in the Mongol armour. There were no unguarded generals to snatch, no chaotic supply lines to raid. The old man of the mountain was watching a tidal wave of metal slowly rise toward his front door. Hulagu's discipline was absolute. He issued strict orders to protect the local Persian populations that submitted to him, ensuring that his army had a stable base of operations. He wasn't interested in a scorched earth policy that would leave his horses starving. He wanted a functional province, minus the assassins. By the time the main body of the Mongol army reached the borders of the Nizari state in 1256, the war was already half won. The Mongols had neutralized the terrain, secured their food, and brought the finest military technology on earth to the base of the mountains. The first test of this machine came at the outlying fortresses of the Quistan region. These were the shield walls of the assassin state, designed to bleed an invader dry before they could ever reach Alamut. The Nizari defenders looked down from their ramparts and saw something they had never witnessed before. The Mongols didn't wait for a formal surrender or try to scale the walls with ladders. They began a rhythmic industrial bombardment. The Chinese engineers assembled their machines with practiced speed, and soon boulders the size of barrels were raining down on the parapets. Under Hulagu's watchful eye, The Mongol archers utilised a specialised heavy bow that outranged the assassins' own defences. They created a no-man's land around each fortress, where any defender who showed his head above the battlements was instantly met with a flurry of high-velocity arrows. This wasn't a battle of bravery, it was a battle of suppression. One by one, the outer towers of the Khuistan strongholds began to crack and groan. The stone, which had stood for generations against the best armies of the Islamic world, yet it was being turned into gravel by the persistent mechanical thud of the Mongol trebuchets. Hulagu sat in his command tent, surrounded by astronomers and scholars, reading reports of the progress. He wasn't a man of the sword as much as he was a man of the ledger. He tracked every stone thrown and every bushel of grain consumed. He was the architect of a ruin that hadn't fully collapsed yet, but the foundations were already gone. As the first of the great assassin fortresses in Khuistan opened its gates in a desperate plea for mercy, the message to the rest of the order was clear. The mountains were no longer high enough to protect them from the Khan's reach. The high plateau of Khuistan, in what is now eastern Iran, had served as the eastern shield of the assassin state for generations. Its landscapes are defined by salt flats, jagged ridges, and a silence that feels heavy with the weight of centuries. Scattered across these heights were dozens of fortresses, each a self-sustaining ecosystem of defiance. The men guarding these walls believed they were the elite. They had spent their lives perfecting the art of the mountain watch, convinced that the sheer verticality of their world was a weapon that no army could overcome. When the first clouds of dust appeared on the eastern horizon in the spring of 1256, the defenders of the fortress of Tun didn't panic. They had seen invaders before. They expected the Mongols to circle the base of their mountain, grow frustrated by the lack of grazing land for their horses, and eventually retreat as the summer heat turned the valleys into ovens. They didn't realise that Hulagu Khan had brought a new definition of time to the battlefield. The Mongol vanguard didn't just arrive, they began to dismantle the very idea of a mountain sanctuary. Hulagu's army moved with a rhythmic industrial persistence that ignored the traditional seasons of war. Thousands of labourers, recruited from across the conquered lands of Central Asia, began digging trenches that encircled the fortress of Tun, cutting off every goat path and secret tunnel. The Mongols weren't looking for a fight, they were looking to build a cage. Once the perimeter was sealed, the Chinese engineers stepped forward. They didn't bother with ladders or suicidal infantry charges. They spent days assembling their traction trebuchets. You see massive wooden engines that utilised a team of dozens of men pulling ropes in unison to hurl projectiles. These weren't just simple stones. The engineers used heavy boulders, jars of incendiary naphtha, and even the carcasses of diseased animals to turn the interior of the fortress into a living hell. The sound of these machines dominated the valley, a repetitive mechanical thud followed by the whistling of 100-pound rock cutting through the thin mountain air. Inside the walls of Tun, the psychological foundation of the order began to crack. The Hashashin were masters of the hidden blade, but a dagger is useless against a boulder falling from the sky. Every time a Mongol trebuchet struck, it sent tremors through the stone foundations that had stood for 2 centuries. The defenders realised that their enemy wasn't interested in their ideology or their threats. The Mongols treated the siege like a mining project. They were systematically turning the fortress into a pile of gravel. After several days of relentless bombardment, the walls of Tun finally groaned and gave way. A massive section of the outer rampart collapsed into the dry moat, creating a ramp of rubble. The Mongol heavy cavalry, who had been waiting in silent formations at the base of the hill, didn't immediately charge. Instead, the engineers moved in with fire arrows and early forms of grenades, clearing the breach with explosive heat. Only when the defenders were blinded by smoke and deafened by the roar of the siege engines did the Mongol storm begin. The fall of Tun was not a battle, it was an execution. The Hulagu had issued a specific set of instructions for the treatment of those who resisted. He wanted the world to understand the cost of defiance. As the Mongol soldiers flooded through the breach, they systematically hunted down every armed man. The Persian historian Juvaini, who accompanied the army, noted the terrifying efficiency of the slaughter. The Mongols didn't kill in a frenzy of rage. They did it with a quiet, administrative coldness. They gathered the surviving defenders in the town square and began the harvest. This massacre served a vital purpose in Mongol siege warfare. It was a message sent via the wind to every other fortress in the region. Within weeks, the governors of nearby strongholds like Gerdku and Lamsar began to receive messengers from the Mongol camp. These messengers didn't carry long, flowery demands for surrender. They carried simple, blunt facts. Look at what happened to Tun. Your walls are stone, but our stones are heavier. Your water will run dry. Your gates will break. Surrender now, and you might live to see the next moon. Resist, and you will become the dust we walk on. The effect was devastating. The aura of invincibility that had protected the assassins for 166 years evaporated in the heat of the Quistan sun. Across the plateau, the command structures of the Nizari state began to fray. Local commanders who had once sworn to die for their imam found themselves staring at the horizon, waiting for the dust clouds that signaled their own annihilation. The shadow state was being dragged into the light, and for the first time the hunters realized they were the ones being tracked. As the Mongol army gathered its machines and moved toward the heart of the Elburz Mountains, the path to Alamut was no longer blocked by armies, but by the growing stench of fear. While the Mongol siege engines were turning the fortresses of Quistan into gravel, a different kind of collapse was occurring inside the walls of Alamut. The Order of Assassins, a group that had survived for nearly 2 centuries through absolute discipline and the iron will of its leaders, was suddenly rudderless. In late 1255, the Grand Master, Al-al-Din Muhammad III, was found murdered. He was a man whose later reign had been defined by mental instability and violent outbursts, and his death left the sect in the hands of his eldest son, Rukn al-Din Kursha. History often places the wrong person in the right place at the worst possible time. Kursha was young, inexperienced, and lacked the fanatical conviction that had made his ancestors so terrifying. He inherited a kingdom of shadows just as the sun of the Mongol Empire was beginning to burn those shadows away. Kursha did not spend his first days as imam preparing for a heroic last stand. Instead, he watched from the parapets of his mountain home as the smoke from burning villages drifted up from the valleys below. He was a man of books and philosophy, more comfortable with the abstract debates of the Ismaili library than the grim reality of logistics and blood. The Persian historian Juvaini, who eventually met the young leader, described his state of mind with cutting precision. He wrote that Kursha was like a snake caught in a basket, twisting and turning with every new report of Mongol progress, and frantically searching for an opening that the heavy Mongol lid had already sealed shut. He was paralyzed by a choice that no predecessor had ever had to make: die as a martyr in a fortress that was no longer invincible, or surrender the legacy of his bloodline to a conqueror who promised only mercy at the end of a sword. Hulagu Khan recognized this weakness from miles away. He didn't just want to kill Kursha, he wanted to use him. The Mongol leader began a campaign of psychological warfare that was just as effective as his catapults. He sent a series of letters to Alamut, each one carefully calibrated to erode the young imam's resolve. Hulagu didn't use the language of a tyrant. He spoke as a pragmatist. He promised that if Kursha descended from his mountain, destroyed his own fortresses and surrendered, he would be treated with the honour befitting a high-ranking noble of the empire. If he refused, Hulagu promised that not even the stones of Alamut would remain to mark where the order had once stood. Within the council chambers of the assassins, a bitter divide erupted. The hardline commanders, veterans who had spent decades sharpening their blades for this exact moment, argued for a scorched earth defence. They believed the mountains would eventually break the Mongol spirit. They pointed to the massive storehouses of grain and the deep wells that had sustained them for generations. But a rival faction of advisors, seeing the sheer scale of the 150,000-man army encircling them, whispered of survival. They saw the fate of Tun and knew that the Mongols did not stop until the job was done. Kursha, caught between these two worlds, began a desperate game of diplomatic stalling. He sent messengers to Hulagu offering partial surrenders, promising to destroy some of his minor castles while keeping the great ones intact. Hulagu had no patience for games. Each time a messenger arrived with an excuse or a half measure, the Mongol army simply moved another 5 miles closer to the heart of the Elburz. Hulagu ordered his engineers to begin levelling the final approaches to the fortress of Maimandiz, where Kershah had taken refuge. This was not a castle built on a high peak like Alamut, but a palace fortress carved into the face of a massive cliff. It was beautiful, opulent, and utterly trapped. The Mongols began to assemble their heaviest machines on the surrounding ridges, positioning them so they could fire down into the open courtyards of the palace. The psychological pressure became physical. The sound of Mongol hammers and saws echoed through the canyons night and day. Kershah's advisors began to defect. Even his own brother was sent to the Mongol camp as a hostage, a move that Hulagu used to gather even more intelligence about the internal defences of the order. The young imam spent his nights staring at the fires of the Mongol camp, which outnumbered the stars in the Persian sky. He realised that the old man of the mountain was no longer a figure of dread. He was a prisoner in a very expensive cage, waiting for the door to be kicked in. By late 1256, the stalling tactics had run out. Hulagu issued a final ultimatum. He gave Kershah 3 days to descend and surrender his person. To emphasise the point, the Mongol trebuchets began a test bombardment. The heavy stones didn't hit the walls, they sailed over them, smashing into the living quarters and the ornate gardens. The message was clear. The Mongols could destroy the imam whenever they chose. The myth of the shadow state was dead. On November 19th, 1256, the gate of Meymun-Diz creaked open. Rukn al-Din Kershah, the last true leader of the assassins, walked out into the cold mountain air to meet his fate. He didn't come as a warrior, but as a supplicant, hoping that the snake in the basket could still find a way to survive the crushing weight of the Khan. When Rukn al-Din Kershah descended from the cliff fortress of Meymun-Diz to submit to Hulagu Khan, he didn't just bring his own life as a peace offering, he brought the keys to the entire Nizari state. Hulagu, ever the pragmatist, misforced the young imam to send messengers to the remaining fortresses, commanding them to dismantle their walls and surrender. Most complied, their spirits broken by the sight of their leader in Mongol custody. But when the Mongol vanguard reached the base of Alamut, they found the gates barred. The garrison at the Eagle's Nest looked down from their 200-metre limestone perch and chose to ignore the commands of their captive imam. To these veteran warriors, Kershah was speaking under duress, and the sanctity of Alamut was more important than the survival of its master. They believed the fortress was physically impossible to take. They were about to discover that the Mongols viewed impossible as merely a problem of engineering. The siege of Alamut began in late 1256 under a sky that threatened the arrival of a brutal Persian winter. The geography of the site was a nightmare for any traditional army. The fortress sat on a narrow ridge with sheer drops on almost every side. The only path up was a zigzagging trail that could be defended by a handful of men with rocks and boiling oil. If Hulagu had relied on a direct assault, he would have lost thousands of men for every yard of ground. Instead, he initiated a display of Mongol siege warfare that bordered on the surreal. He ordered his Chinese engineers to disassemble their massive traction trebuchets and carry the components up the adjacent ridges on the backs of thousands of labourers. They didn't just bring weapons, they built a network of high-altitude firing platforms that allowed them to shoot across the chasm directly at the fortress walls. The air around Alamut soon filled with a sound the mountains had never heard, the rhythmic mechanical thud of the Kameni Gore, or oxbows. These were massive mounted crossbows that could fire heavy bolts over vast distances with terrifying accuracy. Mongol archers positioned on the surrounding peaks maintained a constant rain of arrows that pinned the defenders behind their battlements. While the archers provided cover, the heavy trebuchets began their work. They hurled boulders weighing over 100 pounds across the mountain air, smashing into the stone towers of Alamut with the force of modern artillery. The defenders, who had once boasted of their 10-year food supply, watched as their magnificent masonry was slowly hammered into dust. Nature itself tried to intervene. Thick clouds descended on the peaks, and a heavy snow began to fall, turning the narrow mountain paths into lethal ice slides. In any other campaign, this would have been the signal for the invaders to retreat to lower ground. But the Mongols were born in the harshest winters of the world. They thrived in the cold. Hulagu's troops didn't move an inch. They remained in their tents at the base of the rock, their engineers continuing to calibrate their machines through the fog and sleet. The site of the Mongol camp unshaken by the blizzard and continuing its work with machine-like indifference, destroyed the last remnants of the garrison's morale. They realized they weren't fighting men, they were fighting a force of nature that had been harnessed by iron discipline. The final blow wasn't a grand charge, but the realization of total isolation. The Mongols had systematically intercepted every attempt to send a Fidari out of the gates. The legendary assassins, who for centuries had moved like ghosts through the lines of their enemies, found themselves trapped in a stone cage. On December 15th, 1256, after several days of intense bombardment that breached the outer defences, the garrison of Alamut finally realised that their eagle's nest had become a tomb. They sent word to Hulagu that they would surrender, provided their lives were spared. When the Mongol soldiers finally ascended that narrow path and walked through the gates of Alamut, the world of the Hashashin effectively ended. For 166 years, this rock had been the centre of a shadow empire that dictated the fate of the Middle East. Now, it was just a collection of cold stone buildings filled with starving men and a vast library of secret knowledge. Hulagu did not immediately burn the site. He walked the ramparts himself, marvelling at the sophistication of the water cisterns and the depth of the storehouses. He recognised the genius of the architects who had built this place, even as he prepared to dismantle their legacy forever. The fall of Alamut sent a shockwave through the Islamic world, far greater than any previous Mongol victory. If the eagle's nest could fall, nothing was safe. The shadow that had loomed over the thrones of sultans and kings had been stepped on by the heavy boot of the great Khan, and it would never rise again. Hulagu Khan understood that a living cooperative leader was far more valuable than a dead martyr. Thus, as the gates of Alamut were being dismantled, he didn't cast Rukn al-Din Kushar into a dark dungeon. Instead, he welcomed the young imam into the Mongol camp with a display of hospitality that bordered on the surreal. Kushar was given a seat of honour at the Khan's table, draped in fine Mongol silks, and treated as a distinguished guest of the empire. This wasn't an act of kindness, it was a cold, calculated performance. Hulagu needed the young leader to act as his herald, a mouthpiece that would convince the remaining holdouts of the Nizari Ismaili state to lay down their arms without the need for more costly sieges. The transition from a sovereign ruler of a mountain empire to a puppet of the Khan happened with agonizing speed. Kursha, perhaps still clinging to the hope of saving his people, or simply paralyzed by the luxury of his gilded cage, cooperated fully. He sent messengers to the hundreds of smaller fortresses scattered throughout the region, bearing his personal seal and a clear command: surrender to the Mongols or face the fate of Tun. For many, the sight of their imam's seal was the final blow to their resolve. Fortresses that had stood for generations opened their gates, their garrisons disarmed and their walls systematically levelled by Mongol engineers. Hulagu even indulged Kursha's personal request to maintain the illusion of a lasting alliance. The young imam, strangely preoccupied with status even in his downfall, asked for a Mongol bride. Hulagu granted the request, providing him with a girl of low noble birth, and gifted him hundreds of camels and sheep. To the outside observer, it appeared that the old man of the mountain had found a way to survive the Mongol storm by becoming part of the empire's bureaucracy. But beneath this veneer of diplomacy, the Mongol war machine was already preparing for the next phase. While Kursha was feasting in the Mongol tents, Hulagu's officials were meticulously cataloguing every member of the assassin leadership, ensuring they knew exactly who to target once the imam's usefulness had expired. The limits of this false mercy were tested at the fortresses of Lamsa and Girdku. Unlike the garrison at Alamut, the commanders of these strongholds were unimpressed by Kursha's pleas. They recognised the dynamic for what it was, a hostage speaking for his captor. They refused to surrender, forcing the Mongols to commit to long, grinding blockades. Hulagu's frustration began to leak through his mask of hospitality. He realised that as long as Kursha remained in his camp, he was a distraction, a lingering symbol of a state that Hulagu had been ordered to erase entirely. By the spring of 1257, the strategic landscape had shifted. The majority of the assassin fortresses had been neutralised, and Hulagu's eyes were turning toward a much larger prize: the city of Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Nizari Ismaili state was no longer a threat. It was a ghost. Kursha, sensing the change in the atmosphere, made a fatal mistake. He asked for permission to travel to the Great Khan's capital in Karakoram to plead his case directly to Mongol Khan. Hulagu, eager to rid himself of the burden, agreed. He sent the young imam on a long, arduous journey across the steppes, accompanied by a Mongol escort that was, in reality, a death squad waiting for a signal. The journey was a slow march toward an inevitable end. Kersha travelled thousands of miles believing he was heading toward a diplomatic solution that would secure his family's future. He didn't know that Hulagu had already sent a secret message ahead to the Great Khan. The message was simple: the work in Persia is done, and the instrument of its destruction is no longer required. As the small caravan reached the edges of the Mongolian heartland, the illusion of mercy finally evaporated. The young man who had tried to negotiate with the end of the world found out too late that the Mongols didn't bargain with the past, they simply paved over it. Rukn al-Din Hirshah reached the outskirts of Karakoram in the summer of 1257, expecting an audience with the great Khan Munke. He had travelled thousands of miles across the high, windswept steppes, bolstered by the gifts Hulagu had given him and the illusion of his own continued relevance. When he arrived at the imperial capital, the gates did not open in welcome. Mongol Khan refused to see him. The Great Khan sent a messenger with a cold, final rejection. "Since you have already surrendered and dismantled your fortresses, why have you come here? Go back to your own lands." This was the Mongol way of declaring that a tool had outlived its use. There were no more castles to trade, no more secrets to sell. Kersha was no longer an imam, he was a logistical burden. The journey back toward Persia began under a heavy cloud of silence, where Kersha's Mongol escort, once presented as a guard of honour, now felt like a funeral procession. In the middle of the Mongolian wilderness, far from any witnesses or the mountain peaks of his home, the order arrived from the Great Khan. The party stopped. They led Kersha into a side valley, away from the main road. The Mongols had a specific tradition for dealing with royal blood. They avoided spilling it upon the earth to prevent the soul from haunting the soil. They threw the last leader of the assassins to the ground and kicked him to death, his ribs shattering under the weight of heavy iron-shod boots. His body was left in the dirt, a nameless heap in a vast, indifferent landscape. While Kersha's life ended in the Mongolian dust, a far more systematic horror was unfolding back in the Elburz Mountains. Hulagu Khan had spent the months of Kersha's absence preparing the final solution for the Nizari Ismaili state. He issued a decree that targeted every man, woman and child associated with the order's leadership. This wasn't the heat of battle. It was a cold, administrative harvest. Mongol patrols moved through the conquered territories with lists of names provided by their intelligence officers. They gathered the surviving garrisons of the surrendered fortresses, men who had laid down their swords on the promise of mercy, and marched them into the valleys. There the Mongols systematically beheaded them. The scale of the liquidation was designed to ensure that the Hashashin could never regroup. Mongol soldiers were ordered to find every male descendant of the Nizari line. They moved through the villages like a scythe through wheat. The Persian historian Juvaini, who was an eyewitness to these events, recorded the chilling efficiency of the process. He described how thousands of Ismailis were rounded up and executed in batches, their heads piled into the grim pyramids that had become a hallmark of Mongol conquest. Even infants were not spared. The Mongols sought to cut the root so the tree could never grow again. Only a few groups survived this initial wave of destruction. Some women and children were spared, not out of compassion, but to be sold into slavery across the empire. A few remote fortresses, most notably Gyurdku, continued to resist. The garrison there watched from their high walls as the rest of their world was systematically erased. They held out for years, a lonely island of defiance in a Mongol sea, but they were no longer a state. They were merely a lingering memory. The institutional power of the assassins, their ability to influence kings, move through shadows and shape the politics of the Middle East, had been pulverized. Hulagu Khan watched the smoke from the last burning assassin villages and realized his work in the Elburz was done. He had achieved in less than 2 years what the greatest generals of the Islamic and Christian worlds had failed to do for nearly 2 centuries. He had turned the Order of the Assassins into a historical footnote. With the threat to his rear neutralized and the mountains cleared of shadows, Hulagu turned his massive army toward the next target on his list, the city of Baghdad. The harvest of heads had provided the blood-soaked soil upon which he would build his own sub-empire, the Ilkhanate. The age of the secret society was over. The age of the Mongol administrator had begun. The smell of smoke over the Elburz Mountains in 1256 didn't just signal the burning of timber and flesh. It carried the scent of charred parchment and ancient ink. While the Mongol soldiers were busy stripping the gold from the walls of Alamut, one man moved through the chaos with a very different purpose. This was Atamalik Juvaini, a brilliant Persian historian and high-ranking official in Hulagu Khan's court. He wasn't interested in the treasure chests or the silk hangings. He headed straight for the heart of the fortress, the legendary library of Alamut. For over a century, this room had served as the intellectual nerve centre of the Nizari Ismaili state, housing thousands of volumes on astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and the secret theological doctrines of the order. Juvaini stood before the massive shelves, knowing he had been granted a terrifying privilege. Hulagu had given him permission to enter the library and select any books he deemed valuable, before the rest were fed to the flames. Juvaini acted as a curator of doom. He moved through the stacks with the calculated eye of a man who served the conquerors, but respected the knowledge of the conquered. He pulled down works on celestial movements and intricate mathematical proofs, recognizing their universal worth to the Mongol administration. He saved a handful of historical chronicles and geographical surveys that would help the empire map its new territories. But when his hands touched the theological texts, the core beliefs and secret rituals that had fueled the fanatical devotion of the Fidari, his expression hardened. Juvaini was a devout Sunni Muslim, and to him, the Ismaili faith was a dangerous heresy that had poisoned the region for far too long. He intentionally left the most sacred texts of the order on the shelves, condemning the internal spiritual history of the assassins to an ash heap. The fire that followed was a cultural extinction event. Once Juvaini exited the building with his small pile of acceptable knowledge, the Mongol torches were tossed into the rooms. The dry, mountain air-cured paper caught instantly. Eyewitnesses described the sky over the valley turning grey with the remains of 160 years of thought. This was a deliberate act of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a people from the record of time. Hulagu didn't just want the assassins dead, he wanted them forgotten. By burning the library, the Mongols ensured that the world would never hear the assassin's story in their own words. The old man of the mountain would no longer be a philosopher king in his own right, but a caricature of a drug-addled murderer, painted by the pens of those who hated him. This loss of information created a vacuum that was quickly filled by myth and propaganda. Because Juvaini and other pro-Mongol historians were the only ones left to write the accounts, the assassins were stripped of their political complexity. They were reframed as a cult of mindless killers who operated out of a hallucinogenic haze. The stories of the secret gardens of paradise, and the use of hashish to trick young men into martyrdom, tales that later captivated Marco Polo and the Western world, were largely the product of this post-war narrative. The real history of the Nizari Ismaili state, with its sophisticated urban planning, its diplomatic networks, and its deep intellectual traditions, vanished into the smoke. As the flames died down, Hulagu's engineers moved in to finish what the fire had started. They spent weeks systematically dismantling the stone towers of Alamut, throwing the blocks down into the ravines until the very profile of the mountain was altered. They filled in the deep wells and smashed the intricate irrigation systems that had allowed the fortress to bloom in the desert. They wanted the site to be so inhospitable that no one would ever think to rebuild. The library was gone, the walls were dust, and the leaders were buried in nameless graves. The Mongol victory was so total that for centuries, Vanyabasti. Many historians believed the order had simply blinked out of existence in a single night of fire and blood. Yet, even as the smoke cleared, the irony of Juvaini's mission became apparent. By saving only the useful books and burning the dangerous ones, he inadvertently ensured that the assassins would live on as a ghost in the machine of history. The very act of such extreme destruction made them legendary. The world forgot the reality of their tax codes and their theological debates, but it never forgot the image of the shadow with a blade. The fire at Alamut didn't kill the myth, it forged it into something immortal. The Mongols had conquered the physical world, but in the ashes of the library they had accidentally created a shadow that would haunt the imagination of humanity for the next 1,000 years. The smoke eventually cleared from the Elburz valleys, leaving behind a silence that lasted for centuries. To any traveller passing through the region in the late 13th century, the work of Hulagu Khan appeared absolute. The mountaintops that had once held the world in a grip of terror were now jagged teeth of broken stone, indistinguishable from the natural cliffs. The Great Library was a memory of ash. The Grand Masters were dead, their bloodline supposedly hunted to extinction. On the surface of history, the Mongol war machine had achieved its goal of total annihilation. Yet, as the Mongol Empire itself began to fracture and fade into the annals of time, a strange phenomenon occurred. The shadow did not vanish, it simply changed its shape. Survival for the Nizari Ismailis meant embracing a state of total invisibility. Those who escaped the harvest of heads fled into the remote corners of the world, the high Pamir mountains, the bustling markets of India, and the hidden valleys of Syria. They abandoned the high walls and the poisoned daggers, adopting the practice of taqiyya, or strategic dissimulation. They lived as quiet merchants, humble farmers, and devout scholars, hiding their true identity beneath the surface of everyday life. This was a different kind of warfare, one based on patience rather than provocation. While the Mongols relied on the visible strength of their armies, the Ismailis relied on the invisible strength of their community. The Mongol Empire, for all its terrifying power, was a structure built on conquest and tribute. When the line of great Khans weakened and the horsemen retreated back to the steppes, their administrative grip on Persia dissolved. But the Ismaili faith, stripped of its fortresses and its assassins, proved to be far more durable than the stones of Alamut. Over the centuries, this group evolved from a militant shadow state into a global, peaceful community. Today, the spiritual successor to the Old Man of the Mountain is the Aga Khan, a figure known not for secret killings, but for massive philanthropic efforts, architectural restoration, and international development. The transition from the world's most feared secret society to one of the world's most respected charitable organizations remains one of the most remarkable survival stories in human history. Beyond the religious survival, the ghost of the order took on a second life in the Western imagination. The word assassin itself remains a permanent scar on the English language, a linguistic souvenir of a time when a small group of mountain dwellers could bring empires to their knees. When the Crusaders returned to Europe with tales of the Hashashin, they brought with them a myth that would only grow more distorted with time. In the modern era, this myth has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. We see the echoes of Alamut in the hooded figures of video games, the relentless professionalism of cinematic hitmen, and the high table of modern action epics. We are still fascinated by the idea of the lone individual who can change the course of history with a single, well-placed strike. There is a profound irony in the final reckoning between these two powers. The Mongols sought to preserve their legacy through force and the erasure of their enemies. Yet today, the Mongol Empire exists only in history books and ruins. The Nizari Ismailis, the very people the Mongols tried to wipe from the face of the earth, are still here. They survived not by holding onto their walls, but by letting them go. They realized that a fortress made of stone can be pulverized by a trebuchet, but a fortress made of identity is nearly impossible to breach. The story of the Mongols versus Order of Assassins serves as a timeless study in the nature of power. It shows us that while a superpower can win every battle and destroy every building, it cannot always kill an idea. The eagle's nest fell, the library burned, and the daggers were broken. But the spirit of the people who inhabited those spaces found a way to endure through the darkness. If you've travelled with us through these 10 chapters of blood, shadows, and mountain storms, thank you for your curiosity. The history of our world is often written in the ruins, but the real stories are found in the people who walked away from them. For more deep dives into the forgotten wars that shaped our modern world, make sure to check out our next video on the screen. Don't forget to like and subscribe to join our community of history explorers. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for someone to find the keys to the library.